I received an invite for my sister's wedding, and she mentioned not to bring my husband. I thought it was just a joke, so I went with him anyway. My sister created such a big fuss about it that we had to leave her wedding. But right after 2 days of her wedding, her husband made this post on social media, and it all started to make sense. We realized we just dodged a bullet. My sister and I always had an up and down relationship. We loved each other but weren't the type of sisters who shared every thought or secret. We had our moments, sure, occasional arguments mostly over silly things or the way we saw family roles, but overall, I truly loved her. I've been proud of her achievements, supported her, and stood by her through every life event so far. We had a good relationship until this wedding mess. I've been married to Dan for almost 4 years, and he fits seamlessly into our family. Dan is the kind of guy who makes an effort with the people I love, and I admire that about him. Since he didn't have siblings, he treated my sister like his own, and they had a light-hearted bond that sometimes reminded me of bickering siblings. They tease each other constantly, and he was even there for her when she needed help about a year ago. She'd been struggling with a business venture. She wanted to start a small online jewelry shop, and Dan offered her a loan to get her started interest-free. It was a generous amount, and I've been proud that he was willing to support her. So when her wedding invitation arrived with that strange note asking me not to bring Dan, I was completely caught off guard. It felt like a slap in the face considering how close they were. I went over the note at least 5 times, trying to figure out if it was a joke or if I'd missed some hidden message. Dan laughed it off at first, suggesting maybe she wanted to pull some sort of wedding prank on him, but something about it just didn't sit right with me. I tried reaching out to her directly, texting her a few casual questions about the wedding, but she was vague in her responses, saying she was busy with planning and would call later. Since I couldn't get a clear answer from her, I decided to call my mom. When I asked if she heard anything about Dan not being invited, she just chuckled and said something like, "Oh, you know how your sister is. She's just being her silly self." She thought that maybe my sister was planning something funny for the reception. Her reaction didn't help at all and only added to my confusion. My mom didn't seem to think it was serious, which led me to believe it might just be a harmless prank. I was still unsure, but at that point, I couldn't see why bringing him would cause any real harm. After all, this was a wedding. It was supposed to be a joyful occasion, a time for family to come together, not for weird restrictions and mind games. On the day of the wedding, we arrived at the venue together. As soon as we walked in, I noticed some people giving us odd looks. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the happiness of the day. I figured they were just noticing us because Dan and I had dressed more formally than usual to show respect for the big day. Then I spotted my sister. She was in the middle of a conversation with some of her bridesmaids, but as soon as her eyes landed on Dan, her entire expression changed, her face fell and morphed into anger that was startling. She immediately marched over, her voice shaking with fury as she asked me why Dan was there. She didn't try to keep her voice down, everyone around us could hear the edge in her tone. The mood was tense, and I felt heat rise to my face, embarrassed by her reaction. I tried to pull her aside to talk privately, but she kept going, saying he wasn't supposed to be there and that I was disrespecting her wishes. In an attempt to calm her down, I reminded her that the note had felt like a joke and even Mom had thought so. I asked her to take a breath and tell me what the real issue was, but she wouldn't answer me directly. Instead, she started yelling louder, accusing me of trying to ruin her day. Her fiancé noticed the commotion and quickly stepped in. I figured he would try to mediate to calm her down, but instead he took her side immediately, standing protectively beside her and glaring at Dan. Then out of nowhere he stepped forward and gave Dan a rough shove, telling him to leave right now. I was completely blindsided. The situation had spiraled far beyond anything I'd expected. Torn between defending my husband and preserving what little peace might still exist with my family, things had gone too far. With a broken heart, I took Dan's hand and we left the venue. That night I sat in disbelief. Dan was quiet, and though he didn't say it outright, I could tell he was devastated. He hadn't been trying to make a scene or upset anyone. We genuinely believed we were doing nothing wrong. I tried calling my mom and sister later that night, hoping to clear things up and apologize if there had been some unspoken boundary we'd crossed, but no one answered. 2 days later Dan handed me his phone and told me to look at a post my sister's husband had made. I opened it to see a long bitter rant where he mentioned degenerate people trying to disrupt our day, adding that some people were clearly obsessed with him and his wife. He never named us, but it was obvious who he was talking about. Seeing it laid out like that for the world felt like a betrayal. Here was this man, someone who should have been welcoming family, accusing us publicly of doing something malicious all because we dared show up. It was humiliating and hurtful. It left me feeling helpless. I tried reaching out again, hoping that maybe now after the wedding stress was over they'd be willing to talk, but my calls went unanswered. All I want to know is what exactly I'd done wrong. Was I the bad person for assuming my husband would be welcomed? Should I have taken that note seriously despite how ridiculous it seemed? I thought I was respecting her by showing up and being there for her on her big day, yet everything I'd done seemed to have backfired. I confided in a few close friends who were as stunned as I was. They couldn't wrap their heads around why my sister and her husband would react so strongly. Then one friend suggested something that I hadn't considered. Maybe her husband was jealous of the relationship Dan had with her or felt threatened by his presence. It didn't make complete sense, but it was the only explanation that held some logic. Since that post, I haven't heard from my sister or her husband. My family seems divided, with some relatives reaching out to say that they were sorry about what happened but avoiding taking sides. It's painful to know that my family has been pulled into this mess all because I didn't think my sister's note was serious. Now I'm left questioning every decision, every interaction, wondering if I should have known better. The worst part is that I feel like I've lost not just my sister but my entire sense of family unity. I never wanted to cause a scene or make her big day about anything other than her happiness. Now, though, all I'm left with are regrets and questions I may never have answered. So, here I am, left wondering, was I wrong for bringing Dan? Did I miss a warning sign I should have seen? Or was I right to think that families should be able to share in each other's lives without unspoken rules and unkind reactions? I feel lost and confused, and I don't know if I'll ever fully understand how something that started as a joyful occasion ended up this way. Update 1. Hi everyone. First of all, thank you so much for all your comments and support. I was honestly blown away by how many of you have had similar experiences, and it's comforting to know I'm not the only one going through something like this. Some of your stories have been eye-opening, and it's actually helped me make sense of the crazy events that have happened. Unfortunately, what I'm going through with my family right now is the complete opposite of healing or understanding. After the wedding, we didn't hear from anyone for days. It was like this weird silence, and I started to believe that maybe they just needed space. Dan and I both thought that they'd come around eventually, but then out of nowhere, our phones started blowing up with text messages. It was like the floodgates had opened, messages from family, friends, even some people I hadn't spoken to in years. And they weren't reaching out to offer support or understanding, they were calling me everything from a homewrecker to a selfish brat who had ruined my sister's wedding day. Some of the messages were so hurtful and outlandish that I honestly thought they were jokes at first. But then I realized these people were serious. One message from a cousin said if you loved your sister, you wouldn't have pulled a stunt like that at her wedding. Another relative accused me of trying to sabotage the wedding because I was jealous of my sister's happiness. Apparently, her husband's social media posts had created a ripple effect. In his post, he implied that I was obsessed with their relationship, which sent people into a frenzy, assuming the worst of me without even asking for my side. To make things worse, he left hints that I had gone out of my way to humiliate them by showing up with Dan. Even though I genuinely believed it was all just a misunderstanding, it got so bad that Dan's own family started hearing about it. They'd been friendly with my sister and were shocked at the way everything had turned. His mother even reached out to my mom to try and clear things up, only to be told that I'd made my bed and I have to lie in it, my mom's words. Apparently when Dan's mother told me this, I was devastated. My own mother was siding against me, siding with these awful lies that I'd schemed to upstage my sister on her big day. I also started noticing a strange trend in these messages from family members. Everyone seemed to believe this narrative that I was fixated on my sister's husband, that somehow I'd been trying to insert myself into their lives or had some hidden agenda. It sounded completely ridiculous, yet people who had known me my entire life seemed to buy into it. All of this was so hurtful and bizarre because, as I explained before, my husband Dan had been like a brother to my sister. They'd always had that sibling bond, nothing more. Yet now people were making it sound like I'd intentionally used Dan to hurt her. My sister meanwhile still hadn't reached out. She was ghosting me completely, letting her new husband do the talking indirectly through his nasty post and letting our family tear me apart. In desperation, I tried reaching out to her best friend hoping she might have some insight. Her friend told me she couldn't say much but did mention that my sister had been dealing with pre-wedding nerves and that she'd been influenced a lot by her fiancé's view of family dynamics. Apparently he has a history of being possessive and even had issues with some of her friends leading up to the wedding. That little piece of information got my mind racing. What if he was intentionally trying to cut her off from her family starting with me? A few days later, my worst suspicions were confirmed when the cousin who's always been one to stir the pot sent me a screenshot of another post from my sister's husband. This time he went even further, saying outright that he was grateful to finally be free of certain toxic family members who had been trying to control his new wife. He implied that Dan and I had been part of some vendetta against them and that he'd been forced to defend his wife from our antics. I couldn't believe it. Not only was he spreading these lies but now he was making it sound like we had a long history of being toxic towards my sister. It was horrifying and humiliating. What's worse is people were eating it up. By now all of this had reached mutual friends who had nothing to do with the family, and I was starting to feel isolated in my own community. Even in the face of all this backlash, I couldn't let it go. I had this burning need to confront my sister, to hear from her directly what she thought of everything that was being said about me. So I called her one last time. She didn't pick up but a few hours later I received a text from her, a brief message that read, "You crossed a line you can't come back from. I hope you're happy with the choices you made." The text felt like the end of our relationship. I was stunned and heartbroken trying to make sense of how things had fallen apart so fast. Part of me wanted to go on social media to put my side of the story out there and defend myself against these horrible accusations but Dan urged me to stay quiet, reminding me that it would only fuel the fire. As much as it hurt, I knew he was right. If I started defending myself online I'd only look guilty, like I had something to hide. But it wasn't just about me at this point. Dan was caught in the middle of this mess too. He told me he'd been contacted by his own friends, some who had seen the post, asking why he'd stooped to that level by even showing up. People who had no idea about the note or the context had already painted him as some kind of disruptive figure. It's hard to describe the mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness I feel. My husband has been nothing but kind to my sister and now he's being dragged through the mud. As much as I wish I could turn back time and never go to that wedding, a part of me feels like this would have happened eventually. It's clear now that her husband was intent on isolating her, and it seems I was just the first in line to be cut off. In a way, I feel like I've lost not just my sister but my whole family because of one misunderstanding blown out of proportion. I'm now the homewrecker, the toxic family member, the one who's supposedly obsessed with disrupting other people's happiness, and all I did was show up to support my sister on her wedding day. Update: a lot has been happening that I had no idea about until recently. After a heated conversation with my mom, I'm beginning to see the whole situation in a new, disturbing light. I decided to visit her because I couldn't let things keep spiraling without at least trying to talk it out. I wanted to clear up the lies and find out why my family was so easily swayed by these hurtful rumors. When I got there, my mom seemed defensive, repeating the same things that relatives had been saying, that I was attention-seeking and making a scene at the wedding, even calling me a homewrecker for causing drama in my sister's new marriage. It was the same laundry list of accusations that had been thrown at me for weeks. But then she said something that stopped me in my tracks: "You should have handled things better, especially given how your husband feels about your sister." I was stunned. What was she talking about? I asked my mom to explain what she meant by my husband's feelings for her. My mom's expression didn't change, and it felt like my heart had dropped into my stomach. She started explaining almost nonchalantly how my sister had been concerned about Dan's feelings and how that concern had escalated after her engagement. It turns out that when my sister got engaged to Trent, she shared with him the relationship she had with Dan, which we all saw as a sibling-like bond. But Trent, as I learned through my mom's words, saw things differently. He apparently convinced her that Dan was attracted to her and couldn't be trusted. According to Trent, my husband was infatuated with my sister and he didn't want someone in love with his bride attending their wedding. When I asked my mom why she would even entertain such a ridiculous idea, she shrugged and told me that sometimes people hide their feelings, implying that my husband had somehow been hiding some secret love for my sister all these years. It was absurd. I wanted to laugh but instead I was seething with anger. The brother-sister relationship Dan and my sister had always shared was suddenly being painted as something twisted and inappropriate by Trent's jealous paranoia. And it wasn't just Trent's idea. My sister and even my mom had been swayed by this theory. I sat there shaking, asking my mom how she could possibly believe that Dan, who had treated my sister with nothing but kindness, would have some hidden agenda. She said she had seen signs she'd never noticed before, like the times he'd loaned her money or how he'd be quick to come to her rescue if she needed help. I couldn't believe that basic acts of kindness were now being twisted into something sordid. My mom didn't stop there. She went on to tell me that when my sister first voiced her concerns about Dan, she tried to protect her by keeping her distance from him. Apparently, Trent had told her that Dan was obsessed and would always be a threat to their relationship. He even encouraged her to put distance between herself and me, saying that I was enabling Dan's supposed obsession by always bringing him around. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was as if Trent had been planting seeds of doubt in my sister's mind, reshaping her perception of Dan and by extension me. He created this narrative where Dan and I were both trying to sabotage their happiness, and it was working. I tried to reason with my mom, telling her that none of this made sense. Dan had no reason to be in love with my sister and we'd all been close without any issues before Trent showed up. But she wouldn't listen. She insisted that Trent sees things others don't and that he was only trying to protect my sister. I left her house that day feeling more hurt than ever. Not only had Trent's jealousy fractured my relationship with my sister, but it had also brainwashed my own mother. After that, I went home and told Dan everything. He was speechless. He couldn't believe that the sibling-like relationship he had with her had somehow become this twisted narrative. He recalled every instance he'd helped her, times he thought he was just being a supportive brother-in-law, and how those memories now felt tainted. He was frustrated trying to process how a man he barely knew had managed to turn my family against us using jealousy as his weapon. Later on, I texted my parents letting them know they could believe whatever they wanted but that I had already explained my side and stood by it. I told them I knew Dan was being accused of something completely untrue and that if there had been any truth to it I'd have been the first to address it. They needed to understand that I wouldn't be standing by him just because he's my husband. I would never support anything so wrong if it were true. I went on to say that these allegations were beyond absurd and incredibly hurtful, and that it said a lot about them that they'd chosen to side with their new son-in-law without any real evidence or even giving Dan or me the benefit of the doubt. It's one thing to support your children, but believing Trent's story with no proof and turning against their own family like this was a step too far. Dan and I didn't have the time or energy for such nonsense, and I wasn't going to stand by and let this ridiculous baseless drama keep dragging us down. I let them know that if they wanted to believe in something so absurd then that was their choice, but we weren't interested in being part of this toxic circus anymore. So for now we're waiting to see if they'll come around or keep choosing this false narrative over us. Honestly, I have no idea what will happen next. Final update. Hey everyone, things have actually taken a surprising turn for the better, though it's still hard to process everything that's happened. After I sent that message to my parents, it seemed to shake them up a bit. I think they finally started to realize how twisted and out of character all these accusations were. They took it upon themselves to reach out to some of our relatives and talk through everything that had happened. I'm not entirely sure what was said in those conversations, but whatever it was, it must have made them realize just how bizarre and unfounded Trent's claims were. Since then, I've received apologies from a lot of family members, like cousins, aunts, and uncles. Some even expressed regret for jumping to conclusions without talking to me first. As much as I appreciate them acknowledging their mistake, it still stings. I don't like that so many of them were willing to believe such a ridiculous story. The idea that they thought Dan was acting inappropriately all along, especially with someone he thought of as his sister, hurts. I'm glad they're coming around, but I can't pretend it doesn't leave me with a bitter feeling. However, all of that faded into the background last night because something even more unexpected happened. My sister showed up at my house completely out of the blue. She looked like she'd been through a lot. Her hair was a mess, her eyes were red from crying, and it seemed like she hadn't slept. Despite everything, she's my sister, and seeing her like that broke my heart. I opened the door and let her in, figuring we could talk and maybe get to the bottom of things. As soon as she sat down, she started crying. Once she calmed down a bit, she began explaining what had happened with Trent. She told me that she and Trent had just had a huge argument, one that made her see things from a new perspective. Through her tears, she admitted that Dan wasn't the first person Trent had accused of being interested in her. Apparently, this had been going on for a while. At first, Trent's behavior seemed harmless, maybe even flattering in a strange way. She said it started when they were out in public. Trent would notice random men supposedly staring at her and make little comments about how other guys were checking her out or eyeing her inappropriately. While it felt a bit strange, she thought it was just him being protective. Over time, though, his behavior escalated. His accusations started coming up in almost every situation, and eventually his focus shifted to people in her life, especially Dan. When he began talking about Dan, he was extremely convincing. Trent made it sound like he was genuinely worried, like he was just looking out for her and wanted to keep her safe from anything uncomfortable. He kept bringing it up, and she trusted him, so she went along with it. That's why when he insisted Dan shouldn't come to the wedding, she didn't question it. She thought she was doing the right thing by listening to her fiancé's concerns and respecting his wishes. But after their wedding, things spiraled further. Trent started accusing even more people of having feelings for her. It was no longer just a comment here and there. He began pushing her to quit her job, saying one of her male co-workers had eyes for her and that it wasn't safe for her to be around him. She realized then that this wasn't normal at all. Trent was pushing her to give up her independence and cut people out of her life, isolating her. It was no longer just about Dan or random strangers, it was about controlling who she was and who she had around her. She felt blindsided, manipulated, and betrayed as she finally saw that his so-called protectiveness was really just obsessive and manipulative behavior. She realized that she'd been trapped in his controlling behavior and admitted she felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. My sister was clearly heartbroken and ashamed of how she had treated us. She apologized to me, and I could see the regret in her eyes as she apologized to Dan as well. She explained how she'd let her trust in Trent convince her to go along with everything he said and that she'd made a huge mistake. For the first time, I could see how hurt she was by what she'd done, and I knew she genuinely regretted it. Right now she's staying with us to have some space and figure out what to do next. I know this is an incredibly hard time for her, and it's painful to watch her go through this, but at the same time, I feel a deep sense of relief that the truth is finally out. My husband no longer has to bear the weight of false accusations, and my family can see Trent's behavior for what it really is. Whatever comes next, I'm ready to be there for my sister. I'm still processing everything, but I'm grateful that in the end the truth has come to light and we're on the path to moving forward. Update 4. Hey everyone. I know a lot of you asked for an update, so I'm sorry for going quiet. It's been a busy emotional couple of months and so much has changed. Last time I shared how my sister came over to my place finally realizing how controlling Trent was. She returned to him determined to keep her job and not let him push her around anymore. When she told him though, he completely spiraled. He accused her of being unfaithful, saying that if she wanted to keep working, she must be interested in other men. His reaction was so intense and unhinged that she ended up leaving again and came straight back to me more devastated than ever. It was heart-wrenching to see her go through this, but it also seemed to bring her some clarity. Over the next week we talked a lot, and she began to accept that this was no longer a relationship she wanted to be in. She came to the painful decision to end things and file for divorce. As expected, Trent did not take it well. He showed up at my place pleading and crying, promising he'd change and never act this way again. It was tough to watch, especially since he seemed genuinely remorseful, but my sister stood her ground. She realized that his behavior had crossed so many lines that there was no going back to a place of trust. So in short, my sister's going through a divorce now. It's a difficult time for her, but I'm doing my best to be there for her. Dan has been keeping his distance a bit, which I understand. Everything that went down has put a strain on their relationship, but he's still supportive and checks in on her because he knows she needs all the support she can get right now. My parents have also really stepped up. They've been helping her with the legal stuff and providing emotional support, which has made a huge difference. They've also taken this chance to apologize to both Dan and me, especially Dan, for ever believing Trent's accusations. It's like they finally realized just how off base everything was. Honestly, it's been an intense journey, but I feel grateful for the clarity that came out of it. My sister is in a better place even though it's hard, and my family has become closer.